Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
Hollywood showed the Old West as a land of duels, wild horses, and heroes in white hats. But it forgot half the population. The women of the frontier lived in a reality too brutal and too disturbing for any Hollywood screenwriter to address. These are 15 real facts that official history preferred to bury. Some will outrage you, others will leave you speechless. Brace yourself, this video will change how you see that era. Fact number 1, in several territories of the Old West, 12-year-old girls married 50-year-old men, and it was all perfectly legal. It was not the exception. It was not a scandal. It was routine registered at the courthouse, with the father's signature as the only requirement demanded by law. No judge questioned the 40-year age difference between groom and bride. No law prevented it. The community watched, signed as witnesses, and moved on. In 1892, the gunslinger John Wesley Hardin, known for having killed more than 40 men, married Callie Lewis in Texas, a 15-year-old girl. He was 41. The marriage lasted less than a week. Hardin abandoned her without public explanation. The newspapers that covered each of his shootouts with enthusiasm did not dedicate a single line to what had happened to the girl. Texas did not have a word for that. It only had a courthouse record. The argument used to defend these marriages was always the same. The frontier was harsh, and a married daughter was a protected daughter. The sooner, the better. But there was a truth nobody said out loud. Early marriages reduced the number of mouths to feed on a farm that barely sustained the family. The logic was not one of protection. It was one of livestock. Daughters were economic assets, not human beings with a future to consider. The girl who entered that life at 12 years old had ahead of her decades of hard labor, repeated pregnancies, and total dependence on a man she barely knew. There was no possible return. Divorce was practically impossible. Legal recourse, non-existent. The courthouse that registered the marriage used the same cold language it used to register the purchase of a head of cattle. Childhood ended with a single signature. The most disturbing thing is that the entire social structure accepted this system without questioning. Fathers, judges, pastors, and neighbors. Only at the end of the 19th century did some territories begin to raise the minimum age to 16, and even then with exceptions upon family approval. Even so, the girls of the frontier grew up knowing that their fate would be decided by others, and that the day an older man chose their name was merely a matter of time. Fact number 2. In the Old West, a woman who lost her reputation did not get a second chance. Ever. It did not matter how it happened, or whether it was choice, deception, or violence suffered. The result was always identical. Society had a term for her, fallen woman. And that classification was, in practice, an irreversible social sentence that defined the entire rest of her life with no right to appeal. Families abandoned these women. Communities expelled them. Churches forbade them from entering. Without reputation, there was no marriage. Without marriage, there was no livelihood. And without livelihood on the frontier, where no social safety net existed, the options were reduced to a single way out. The brothel was not a choice. It was the only door that society left open for a woman who had lost what they called honor. But here comes the detail that reveals everything about that society. Before the wedding, the groom's family could demand that midwives or doctors perform examinations to verify the virginity of the bride. It was an accepted, formalized practice considered prudent. A young woman who did not pass the examination was returned to her family. Returned, like defective merchandise. With all the examination documentation recorded in writing on paper, that woman lost everything in a single day. The future husband, the status of a respectable woman, the possibility of another marriage, and most of the time, the very roof over her head. Parents who had invested years raising a daughter within the moral standards of the era sent her away with the same coldness of someone closing a deal that did not go through. The failure was the daughter's. The shame was too, the future, non-existent. The system was circular and perfect in its cruelty. Society created the conditions for the fall, total ignorance, economic dependence, absence of protection, and then punished with maximum severity anyone who fell. But the men who caused that fall, they went back home. They frequented the same saloons, the same churches, the same community dances, without comment, without charges, without any consequence whatsoever. The expression fallen woman survived the Old West because the system that created it also survived. It only changed its name and its address. The logic remained the same. A woman who stepped outside the limits imposed by society did not deserve protection, and a woman without protection was disposable. The frontier did not invent this rule. It only applied it with more brutality, more speed, and with less disguise than anywhere before. Fact number 3. In the Old West, women were used to seal agreements between ranching families, between indigenous tribes, and in the most revealing case, between white settlers and indigenous chiefs. Men handed over their own daughters as gifts to guarantee peace in disputed territories. It was a common, accepted, and documented practice. The frontier had its own rules, and this was one of them. The records of the era did not use euphemisms. Sacagawea, whose face is now engraved on American coins, came to Lewis and Clark as the property of a trapper who received her as payment for a gambling debt. She was around 14 years old. A daughter listed alongside heads of cattle, rifles, and bales of fabric. Signed, delivered. There was no different language for people and for goods. They were all assets within a negotiation with a deadline and a price. Among ranching families, marriages were negotiated like business mergers. The bride's father needed access to a water spring. The groom's father needed hands for the harvest. They talked, closed the deal, and informed the children afterward. The young woman's opinion was not consulted because she was not part of the deal. She was the object of the deal. There was an enormous difference between those two positions. When white settlers adopted the habit of including daughters in peace treaties with indigenous tribes, they added an extra layer of brutality to the system. William Bent, founder of Bent's Fort in Colorado, married the daughter of Cheyenne Chief Gray Thunder as an explicit part of a commercial agreement. These were men who knew that those women had rights on paper, and they ignored them anyway. The paper said one thing, the practice said another, the practice always won. No agreement sealed with women as bargaining chips guaranteed protection for them on the receiving end. A woman delivered in a peace negotiation lived between two worlds without belonging to either of them, abandoned by the family that gave her up, a stranger to the community that received her, without protection from either side. The American frontier charged the highest price from those who had no voice to refuse the deal. Fact number 4. In the 19th century, American doctors had a diagnosis for any woman who contradicted her husband, refused domestic obligations, or simply cried too much. They called it female hysteria. The prescribed treatment was liquid opium, sold under the commercial name of laudanum, prescribed with the same naturalness as cough syrup, and it created chemical dependency within weeks. The diagnosis of hysteria was of astonishing convenience. It covered any behavior that challenged the domestic structure: excessive crying, nervousness without apparent cause, refusal of conjugal obligations, and opinions contrary to the husband's. Any woman who displeased could be classified this way, and the classification gave the husband the immediate right to call the doctor to correct the problem. Laudanum was a mixture of opium and alcohol that generated dependence rapidly. Within a few months, the woman who previously contradicted her husband was completely submissive, not out of conviction, but out of chemical addiction installed by the medical treatment itself. The doctor was called to solve a behavioral problem and left behind a dependent woman. And everyone considered this a medical success. Female addiction to laudanum became an epidemic in the last quarter of the 19th century. Pharmacies in the West sold the product openly, without a prescription. Women of all social classes consumed it, some by medical prescription, others because they needed relief from a life they could not change. The addiction was convenient for husbands, doctors, and pharmacists. For the women, it was a chemical trap with no way out. Here's the detail that closes the argument. The same doctor who prescribed laudanum for the wife, considered hysterical, could be called by the husband to commit her to an asylum if the addiction that the treatment itself created became too much of a problem. The woman entered a cycle with no exit. Disobedient became hysterical. Hysterical became dependent. Dependent became insane. Each step with official medical validation. Decades later, researchers found this pattern buried in the archives. 19th century women were the first documented victims of an opioid epidemic that the country would pretend not to recognize for more than 100 years. The diagnosis of female hysteria was removed from American medical manuals only in 1952. The diagnosis lasted longer than the entire Old West. Nobody apologized. Fact number 5. In the Old West, you could flip through a catalog and order a wife with the same ease with which you ordered a farming implement. Matrimonial agencies published advertisements describing women by age, state of health, and degree of moral character. Men sent money without ever having seen their faces. The woman arrived in the West and found a stranger with a marriage contract in hand. On the women's side, the decision was rarely free. In the East, opportunities were scarce. Poorly paid jobs, economic dependence on parents, the prospect of spinsterhood in a society that treated single women as permanent social failure. The matrimonial catalog was a way out. Risky, uncertain, but real. Many knew exactly what they were getting into, and they got into it anyway, without alternative. The journey was a gamble with no guarantee of return. Weeks and stagecoaches and trains, all the money spent on the fare. Upon arriving, many discovered that the prosperous rancher from the advertisement was an impoverished settler in a dirt cabin without windows. What the advertisement called fertile lands was dry prairie where barely grass grew. The frontier sold dreams with invisible fine print and charged the price upon arrival. Some of these marriages worked surprisingly well. Mutual necessity created bonds that time transformed into something resembling genuine affection. But others were traps with no way out. Women trapped on isolated farms with husbands they barely knew, without neighbors for miles, without money for the return fare. The mail that brought hope also delivered the trap along with it. The detail that most reveals this system is the vocabulary of the advertisements. Women were described with the same terms used for breeding animals: healthy, strong, of good family, no known defects. The agency was the intermediary, the money circulated, the woman was the product. And nobody, at any moment throughout the entire process, considered it relevant to ask whether she was happy with the deal. Fact number 6. The isolation on the American plains had a medical name: prairie fever. Records from the era describe real psychotic episodes in women who spent months without seeing another human being besides the husband and children. An enormous sky, constant wind, and silence that never ended. The horizon repeated itself in every direction. The human brain simply was not built for that level of isolation. Doctors who visited remote farms documented the cases with disturbing precision. Women who stopped speaking for weeks, who stared at nothing for hours without blinking, who asked to run toward the horizon with no destination and no planned return. The collapse was not merely emotional, it was cognitive, neurological. And on most isolated farms, the husband did not even call the doctor. Here's the detail that transforms everything. If the wife showed symptoms of prairie fever, the husband had the legal power to commit her by a completely unilateral decision, without a trial, without an independent doctor, without a defined term. One signature was enough. The same law that did not allow the woman to sign a contract or open a bank account gave the husband total control over what happened to her body and her mind. Many of these women never returned home, not because they remained ill, but because the husband did not request the discharge. Without the request from the legal guardian, no institution released the patient. Meanwhile, the husband kept running the farm, raising the children, managing the assets. The woman disappeared from public life and from legal life with a single signature. No appeal, no deadline, no testimony that counted. What the records show is disturbing. In many cases, the diagnosis of insanity coincided with documented marital conflicts. Disagreements over properties, divorce petitions, accusations against the husband. Prairie fever was sometimes a legitimate diagnosis, and sometimes it was the cheapest solution for a husband who wanted to get rid of an inconvenient wife without the public scandal of divorce. Fact number 7. Pioneer women lived on average 35 years. Not 40, not 50. 35 years of average life documented in frontier cemeteries. While movies show resilient heroines surviving everything, the reality was that the leading cause of female death on the American frontier was not a shootout, a bandit, or an epidemic. It was childbirth. Giving life very often meant dying. A typical woman on the frontier had between 8 and 12 pregnancies throughout her life. 8 to 12 times going through childbirth without anesthesia, without a hospital, and frequently without a doctor, only with the help of neighbors or completely alone. Each pregnancy was a real risk of death. Most women did not complete their 3rd decade of life. They had children before being sure they would survive to raise them. Childbirth on the frontier happened under conditions that today would be classified as medieval. Dirty cabins, water not boiled, instruments not sterilized. Puerperal fever, an infection contracted after childbirth, killed more women than any other complication. It was completely preventable with basic hygiene. But nobody at the time understood the connection between hygiene and death, that ignorance had a cost measured in lives. Doctors of the era still debated whether washing hands before attending a woman in labor made any difference. The Hungarian Ignaz Semmelweis had proven in 1847 that hygiene reduced deaths by up to 90%, and he was ridiculed by American medicine for decades. While the debate continued in universities, women continued dying from infections caused by the hands of the doctors who were supposed to save them. Pioneer cemeteries in Kansas, Nebraska, and Wyoming show the same repeated pattern. Rows of female graves, all between the ages of 20 and 35, many with inscriptions recording children buried alongside their mothers. The frontier killed men with bullets and shootouts. It killed women with the everyday life that society considered completely normal, natural, and inevitable for them. Fact number 8. In the Old West, a woman had no right to refuse her husband under any circumstance. The law was explicit. Marriage was legally interpreted as permanent, total, and irrevocable consent. Once married, the woman no longer held full autonomy over her own body. The husband decided. The courts agreed. Any woman who tried to question this was told there was no legal standing. Courts in the West simply did not accept cases of conjugal violence of this nature. If a woman tried to report it, the judge himself would dismiss the case without trial, citing the doctrine that defined matrimony as a permanent cession of rights. Lawyers who tried to defend these women were ridiculed by their professional colleagues. The law was not negligent. It was a declared accomplice. The origin of this doctrine was English. The jurist Matthew Hale had written in the 17th century that a wife could not revoke the consent given at the altar. This argument was copied, adopted, and defended in American courts for more than 200 years. A single sentence written by a man dead for centuries defined in practice the life of living women on the American frontier of the 19th century. Frontier doctors documented in private diaries visits to wives with serious injuries of domestic origin, and recorded that they could not do anything legally. The law protected the aggressor, medicine verified the damage, and the woman remained there, in the middle, without recourse from either side. The system had been built to function exactly this way, with every piece fitted to always guarantee the same result. To put the size of this reality in context, the last American state to legally recognize this type of conjugal violence as a crime was only in 1993. That is right, 1993. What the Old West normalized at the courthouse was still active law in parts of the United States when the internet already existed and the cell phone was already in people's pockets. The frontier ended, the law took longer. Fact number 9. Between 1854 and 1929, more than 200,000 children were taken from the streets of New York and sent to the American interior on trains, with the promise of adoptive families, education, and a better life than the city sidewalks could offer. The program had a pretty name, orphan trains. What awaited the girls on that train was very different from what any promotional pamphlet described. The process was simple and brutal. The children arrived at the stations and were presented to local families as at a fair. People examined their teeth, tested their muscles, and decided whether they wanted to take someone. There was no screening of the receiving families. There was no background investigation. There was no follow-up afterward. The child was handed over. The train continued its journey, and the program recorded another success. Families that received girls did not need justification, testimony, or a record of intentions. The subsequent follow-up was minimal when it existed at all. Isolated farms with no accessible school, with no nearby neighbors, the girls who arrived expecting a family frequently found hard labor before dawn, normalized violence, and isolation that made any request for help impossible. The records that survive tell stories that the program's organizers preferred not to publish. Girls used as unpaid domestic labor for years, cases of violence never investigated. Children who tried to escape had nowhere to go. They were hundreds of miles from any place they knew, without money, without a registered name, without anyone who would answer for them. The cruelest part is that the program was celebrated as high-level philanthropy. The organizers received donations, praise from the press, and broad public recognition. From the perspective of the eastern cities, poor children were being saved. From the perspective of the girls, the trade was very often from urban poverty to rural servitude. Nobody was ever held accountable. The program lasted 75 years. Fact number 10. In the Old West, beating your wife was not a crime. It was a right recognized by law. The doctrine called chastisement explicitly recognized the husband's power to use physical force to discipline his wife when he deemed it necessary. Lawyers cited this doctrine in Western courts until the 1880s, and the judges accepted the argument. The logic was the same, used to justify the discipline of children. The husband was the head of the family. The wife, just like the children, was under his direct authority. And authority, to be effective, needed physical backing when words were not enough. It was not sadism in the eyes of the law, it was recognized family management. The Old West had a technical name for domestic violence, and that name was not crime. Women who showed up at police stations with visible injuries were frequently advised to go back home and resolve the problem internally. If the case reached a judge, the aggressor invoked the doctrine of chastisement and the defense was accepted. I corrected my wife within reasonable limits was a legally valid argument. What defined those limits was the judge himself, invariably a man. The movement for the abolition of conjugal chastisement began in the second half of the 19th century, but faced fierce resistance. Jurists argued that criminalizing the husband's physical control over the wife would violate the privacy of the home. The same privacy that protected families from nosy neighbors also protected aggressors from legal consequences. The walls of the house were the aggressor's best defense. The most brutal paradox of this doctrine was in the divorce courts. A woman who requested separation alleging assaults needed to prove that the injuries were excessive, beyond what the doctrine allowed. If the assault was considered within the reasonable limit, the divorce was denied. The law did not protect women. The law regulated how much damage was acceptable to inflict upon them. Those are different things. Fact number 11. The systematic violence against indigenous women. On the American frontier, women of the tribes lived in a zone where the law simply did not apply to them, without citizenship, without access to courts, without protection from any public sphere. Any crime committed against them was, in practice, invisible, not because nobody saw, but because nobody with the power to act considered it necessary to do anything about it. The most documented case is Sand Creek. In November 1864, American soldiers attacked a Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment under the official protection of the government. The majority of the victims were women, children, and elderly people. Testimony before Congress describes mutilations and sexual violence committed against women both alive and dead. Trophies taken from the bodies were publicly displayed in the streets of Denver. Congress recorded everything, filed it, and punished nobody. The commander of the attack, Colonel Chivington, was not only not tried, he received military honors. His troops returned to Denver as heroes and were received with public celebration. The newspapers described the massacre as a glorious victory of the frontier. The brutality against indigenous women and children was not a buried secret. It was printed news. It was public celebration. The horror was there, visible, and nobody with authority moved to act. Sand Creek entered the records because dissenting soldiers testified. The majority of crimes committed against indigenous women on the frontier left no trace whatsoever. There were no journalists. There were no investigators. There were no survivors with enough of a voice to be heard. What is documented exists because someone decided to document it. What is not documented is exactly what should disturb us most deeply. The impunity was not the exception. It was the pattern. Throughout decades of westward expansion, indigenous women were the most vulnerable and least protected victims of the entire American frontier. Abusers, murderers, and thieves who acted against them were rarely even identified. American law defined who deserved protection, and that definition excluded these women in an explicit, systematic, and completely intentional manner. Fact number 12. In the 1870s and 1880s, a new form of commerce flourished in the Old West. Photographers traveled through indigenous territories producing images of tribal women in intimate and humiliating situations. These photographs were printed as postcards and sold openly in saloons, pharmacies, and general stores throughout the American West. It was a prosperous market and completely invisible to the law. The cards circulated from hand to hand, were sent through the United States mail, and collected as curiosities of the wild frontier. The women photographed never consented. They were never consulted. Many never knew that their images were circulating through thousands of hands in cities hundreds of miles away. And they never received a single cent from the profitable commerce generated by their humiliation. The argument that justified this commerce was simple and cynical. Indigenous women were not considered American citizens. They had no recognized legal rights. They could not sue anyone. The photographer who entered an indigenous community, produced the images, and left to sell them in the cities, committed no crime recognized by law. The absence of rights made the exploitation legally invisible. These cards reached as far as Europe. Collectors in Paris and London paid high prices for exotic images of wild America. The photographed women were described on the labels as savages, primitives, and natives in their natural state. This language deliberately transformed human beings into specimens to be cataloged, and the market bought this vocabulary with enthusiasm and without any questioning. The most revealing thing is what this commerce says about the hierarchy of humanity in the Old West. A white woman photographed without consent in an intimate situation would generate public scandal and a lawsuit. An indigenous woman under the same conditions generated a postcard, profit, and no legal consequence. The frontier defined who had dignity and who did not based on the color of skin. Just like that in writing. Fact number 13. In the Old West, the death of the husband did not free the woman, it destroyed what remained of her world. Without a husband, a woman automatically lost access to land, to bank credit, and to legal protection. 3 things without which it was impossible to survive on the American frontier. The morning had barely begun when the brutal urgency of remarrying was already knocking at the door without ceremony and without room for choice. 19th century American law was clear. Properties belonged to the husband. When he died, the widow was left with temporary usufruct until the inheritance was resolved. If there were adult children or relatives of the deceased nearby, they could contest. And they often won. Women who had worked decades on a farm could be legally expelled by the dead husband's family, with judicial backing. The speed of widow remarriages in the Old West was not a lack of feeling for the deceased. It was pure survival math. Without a husband, the woman lost access to credit at the local general store. She lost protection against property invasions. She lost the legal status to sign official documents. A widow who waited too long to remarry could lose everything before winter arrived. There was one final trap embedded in remarriage. Everything the woman possessed, the land, the animals, the assets accumulated in the previous marriage, automatically passed to the new husband on the day of the ceremony. She did not negotiate. She kept nothing in her own name. The widow who remarried out of survival necessity handed over along with it any remnant of independence she still had saved. The Old West created extraordinarily resilient women, not in spite of this system, but because of it. To survive under those conditions required being intelligent, strategic, and tough in ways that no movie ever showed. The widows who managed to keep their lands and raise their children alone on the frontier do not appear in history books because history prefers the hero with a revolver on his hip. Fact number 14. Women who suffered violence in Old West brothels rarely generated a police investigation. Documented cases in Tombstone, Deadwood, and Dodge City show deaths systematically classified in official records as accident, cause unknown, or simply with no record at all. In none of these towns was a single client ever brought to trial for the death of one of these women. The logic behind the omission was explicit and cynical. These women were outside the protection that the law extended to those considered respectable. The society of the era said they had chosen that life, ignoring that for most there was no real choice. Women outside social protection were, in practice, outside legal protection as well. The law followed morality, and morality had decided who deserved protection. Pimps and brothel owners functioned as an additional layer of control. Women who tried to leave owed debts for lodging, for clothing, for food. Debts that grew faster than they could be paid, reinforced by the permanent threat of violence. The frontier called this business. The modern vocabulary has another name for this arrangement, but there was no law to name it at the time. In rare cases where the violence was too severe to ignore, the police showed up and asked token questions. But the investigations rarely advanced. Witnesses were afraid. The suspects were often influential men, the same ones who financed local campaigns, controlled lines of credit, and had direct relationships with the police officers themselves. The most convenient solution was always cause of death unknown. The real number of violent deaths in Old West brothels will never be known. The records were precarious, the reasons for not recording were many, and the lives of these women had officially minimal value to the system that depended on them economically. Deadwood profited, Tombstone profited, Dodge City profited. And the women who generated that profit died without anyone needing to explain the reason. Fact number 15. Asian women arrived in the Old West carrying a debt that was never meant to be paid. The cost of the Pacific crossing, between $40 and $80, was recorded as a debit the moment they set foot in the port of San Francisco. The destination was already decided before they even touched American soil, brothels in the mining towns of the interior West. The system was designed to be eternal and inescapable. The debt never truly decreased because the owners added costs permanently: clothing, food, lodging, and protection. Every expense became a new debit. Every sick day was unworked time added to the principal account. Women who calculated the balance discovered they owed more after years of work than they owed when they arrived at the port. The youngest arrived at 12, 13 years old. Some convinced by agents who promised legitimate jobs in restaurants or laundries. Others sent by impoverished families in China who did not know, or preferred not to know, what awaited their daughters on the other side of the ocean. The importation debt was not a detail of the system. It was the structure of the system. Some died without ever paying it off. In the end, the Old West that cinema sold and what women actually lived are two completely different stories. One is about men who conquered a frontier with bravery. The other is about women who survived, or tried to survive, the system that those same men built. Both happened in the same place at the same time. Only one of those stories became legend.